When making a build, one of the first thing any of us does is pick a weapon. In fact, most builds come from a desire to use a specific weapon. This is completely normal. When picking weapons, we can probably say that the most important factor is how cool it looks, or what its special abilities are. But after that, we take a look at its stats. Base damage, damage scaling, Ash of War, weight, moveset, and so on. We do something very similar with shields too. We might pick one or the other depending on how cool it looks, but at the end of the day, a shield is good because of its guard boost, its damage negation, or its requirements. That being said, have you ever had this happen to you? On the left, you will see my character attacking an enemy that is guarding with a great shield. My attack bounces off. On the right, you will see the opposite. An enemy is attacking my character while I'm guarding with their great shield. The enemy's attack bounces off. What is this, and why does it happen? Well, my dear viewer, it is my absolute recommendation that when you pick armaments, you pay attention to their hardness. Hardness is a very specific hidden stat that all armaments share and that is extremely important, but one which the game says nothing about. Not only this, but we cannot find this information anywhere in-game. I can tell you that hardness is the level of sturdiness that an armament has, allowing it to withstand blows from other entities. Armaments with a higher sturdiness will resist the confrontation, while armaments with a lower sturdiness will bounce and recoil off their target. Bouncing off an enemy's shield is a problem, and having an enemy bounce off your shield is very advantageous, as it lets you counterattack very safely. As you can see, this makes hardness a very important characteristic to keep track of, whether you are attacking or defending. In total, there are 6 levels of hardness. It starts at level 0, representing the weakest level, and it goes all the way to level 5, the strongest level. Later in the video, we will go through each level one by one in order to see which weapons belong to each level. Right now, let's go over the rules of hardness and what happens when different levels meet in battle. Rule number 1. If it meets it, it beats it. This is the basic rule, and it means that when a weapon attacks an entity, it must have the same level of hardness or higher. Otherwise, the attack will bounce off. For example, if a weapon with a level 1 hardness attacks a target with the level 2 hardness, it will bounce because it is of a lower level. If the same weapon with level 1 hardness attacks a target with level 0 hardness, it will not bounce because it is of a higher level. And lastly, if the same weapon with level 1 hardness attacks a target that also has level 1 hardness, it will not bounce because they are of the same level. Let me show you a very quick visual example so you can understand. Here you see a basic Godric soldier attack my great shield with the Lordsworn straight sword. As the name implies, the weapon the enemy is using is a straight sword, and this kind of weapon has a hardness level of 1. My character is guarding with the Icon shield. This is a great shield with a hardness level of 2. Since the enemy's weapon has a lower level of hardness, their attack will bounce. As you can see, as long as you know the hardness level, it is very easy to predict the result. Rule number 2. Hardness only applies to one-handed weapons. This is very clear. Hardness only applies to any weapon that you use with one hand. If you two-hand your weapon, the rules of hardness do not apply to your attack. In the same way, if you do a running attack, a jumping attack, or a charged R2, the rules of hardness will not apply to your attack. That being said, if you are dual-wielding weapons, also known as power stancing, hardness will apply to your attacks. You may be using 2 weapons, but you're still using one hand for each one. Even if you do an L1, a power stance attack, you have to follow the levels of hardness. I present you with some visuals to evidence this rule. You will see me attack a Godric soldier that is guarding with a great shield using a dagger. The dagger is level 0 hardness, while the great shield is level 2 hardness. Still, you will see that when two-handing the dagger, when using a running attack, when using a jumping attack, and when attacking with a charged R2, I do not bounce. On the other hand, when power stancing 2 daggers and attacking with L1, my attack does bounce. Rule number 3. Hardness is a player stat. This means that it only applies to players. When enemies in the game attack us, they follow their own specific rules. In fact, the rules for enemies vary on a case-by-case basis. Some enemies have more hardness than they should, while others have less. This leads to many different situations. Sometimes the players are benefited because the enemies have less hardness than they should, while other times we are hindered because enemies have more hardness than they should, taking into consideration the weapon they are using. Let me show you some examples. On the left, you will see an Omen attacking me with a warped axe. This armament, like the name implies, is an axe-type weapon. It is level 1 hardness. I am blocking with the Icon Shield. This is a great shield with level 2 hardness. If we were to follow the basic rules of hardness, this Omen should be bouncing off my shield when attacking me with this axe. As you can see, this does not happen. The Omen has specific rules that make its attacks not bounce off a shield with hardness level 2. This special rule goes against the player. That said, on the right, you will see a red-maned Misbegotten attacking me with an iron greatsword. Again, as the name implies, this is a greatsword type weapon and it has a hardness level 2. As usual, I am blocking with my Icon Shield, a great shield with level 2 hardness as well. Since the enemy's greatsword is the same hardness as my shield, it should not bounce. Remember that if it meets it, it beats it. But this does not happen. Even while using a hardness level 2 weapon, this enemy is bouncing off my shield. In this case, this Misbegotten's special rules favors the player. It is not strange that the game will give different properties to weapons when they are wielded by an enemy in comparison to when they are wielded by the player. This happens all the time, especially with boss weapons. That said, the reality is that rule number 3 is very volatile because if enemies have their own specific rules, then it is impossible to know what will happen until it actually happens. As you can see, hardness is very easy and simple to understand. The only problem is that the game does not teach it to the player. That being said, once we know this information, we can use it to better prepare our builds in order to counter certain problematic enemies and strategies. This kind of information is particularly useful for tank-type characters, my favorite kind, because it lets you understand which attacks you should be blocking and which ones you should be dodging in order to get the biggest punish possible. At this time, you know what hardness is and the rules that it follows. You understand its benefits and how to use it. This means that the only thing left to do is go through each level of hardness one by one and see which entities are part of which level. This information should help you when you are making builds and planning your characters. We will be going from the lowest level all the way to the highest one. Let's start with level 0. First of all, the player character has level 0 hardness. This means that no attack will ever bounce off our character. Does not matter how much defense or poise we have. If we get hit, it will not bounce. Next, blocking with a small shield has level 0 hardness. No matter what kind of attack we receive, if we block it with a small shield, it will never bounce. Now, enemies. My dear viewer, there are a lot of enemies in the game and most of them have level 0 hardness. If I were to list them all, we would be here for a very, very long time. As such, in regards to enemies, I will release a blanket statement. Any enemy that does not specifically appear in any other level of hardness should be considered to be level 0, and this means that none of our attacks will bounce off them. Finally, weapons. The following have level 0 hardness, meaning that their attacks will bounce off entities of hardness level 1 and above. These are daggers, thrusting swords, katanas, twin blades, spears, reapers, non-strike fists, claws, and staffs. Moving on to level 1. First of all, guarding with a medium shield has level 1 hardness. This means that an attack from a level 0 enemy or weapon will bounce off. Finally, weapons. The following have level 1 hardness, meaning that their attacks will bounce off entities of hardness level 2 and above. These are straight swords, heavy thrusting swords, curved swords, axes, halberds, seals, torches, and small shields when attacking. Next up, level 2. Starting with the enemies, the glintstone miner and all crystallians have level 2 hardness. This means that attacks from weapons with hardness level 1 and below will bounce off these enemies. Then, players that are guarding with the Great Shield or that are using the incantation Dragon Bolt's Blessing will have level 2 hardness, meaning that any attack that we receive from levels 1 and below will bounce off of us. Finally, weapons. The following have level 2 hardness, meaning that their attacks will bounce off entities of hardness level 3 and above. These are great swords, curved great swords, great axes, hammers, great spears, and strike-type fists. Let's continue with level 3. Starting with enemies, the Stone Digger Trolls, the Miners, and Simple Turtles all have level 3 hardness. This means that attacks from weapons with hardness level 2 and below will bounce off these enemies. Then, players that are guarding specifically with the Ant's Skull Plate Great Shield will have level 3 hardness. Understand that this applies to this specific Great Shield only. Finally, weapons. The following have level 3 hardness, meaning that their attacks will bounce off entities of hardness level 4 and above. These are colossal swords, flails, great hammers, colossal weapons, medium shields, and great shields when attacking. Coming up, level 4. Starting with enemies, there are only 2 that have this level of hardness. They are Muriel, the Pope Turtle, and the Walking Mausoleum. This means that attacks from weapons with hardness level 3 or below will bounce off these enemies. Then, players using the Barricade Shield Ash of War and the Iron Jar Automatic will have level 4 hardness. Any attacks that we receive in these 2 cases that have level 3 hardness or below will bounce off of us. Finally, weapons. The following have level 4 hardness, meaning that their attacks will only bounce off entities that are of maximum hardness, meaning level 5. These are whips, the specific weapon Cipher Pada, and the specific weapon Coated Sword. Finally, level 5. There is only one single entity in the entire game that reaches this level of hardness. One single entity that will make every other one-handed attack bounce off their magnificent body. No other enemy, weapon, or condition will ever reach the amount of sturdiness that this entity enjoys. My dear viewer, behold the crystalline crab. There is no higher level and there is nothing more hard-headed than this unit of a crab. Souls games have always had hidden stats and mechanics. Sometimes they aren't important, and sometimes they are. When it comes to hardness, it is actually a characteristic that players can really take advantage of when it comes to weapon selection. Sometimes weapons will do similar damage and have similar range. We could pick one or the other based on many factors, but maybe the smartest thing to do is to pick the one that will bounce off the enemy in the least amount of cases. This is specifically useful when we plan to run a build that uses shields a lot, because we will be using our weapon with one hand more often. While it is true that we can circumvent this stat by using weapons with two hands, that does mean that we are no longer able to block with a shield. As a result, when it comes to tank-type characters, hardness becomes extremely important, both for the attacks that we give and those that we receive. Overall, I hope that you have found this information useful, and I hope that you can take advantage of it when it comes to making your own build. My dear viewer, no matter what they say, at the end of the day, hardness does matter. Thank you very much for your time, and I hope I get to see you on the next one.